Welcome, everybody, to our monthly Reg Briefs webinar. Today, we are going to discuss global regulatory strategy. All right, let's get started. Um, so, today's topic is global regulatory strategy, and we'll talk about the considerations, challenges, and tips for harmonization and then communication. A brief overview of housekeeping rules. Today's webinar is being recorded. We invite your questions and comments. Please find the chat box on your screen and post them there. If you need help with anything, please feel free to contact Holly at that email address that you see. And after the webinar, we really appreciate your feedback, especially with respect to anything you would like to see us improve, and also on any new topics that would be of relevance to you, and we can bring the right experts to have a discussion. So it's with great pleasure uh, I would like to extend a warm welcome to Dr. Miriam Gavel Cruz. Um, she is a very experienced regulatory professional. Currently, she is the director and global regulatory lead at Novo Nordisk. Previously, she worked at Biogen and also before that in regulatory consulting companies, by which she supported commercialization of academic technologies as a research and alliance officer at the one and only University of Maryland, Baltimore, which is also where I belong. With over 15 years of experience, Miriam advises on regulatory strategy and commercialization for small molecules and biologics. She has authored regulatory submissions and led applications in the US and Europe, including meetings with regulatory agencies and applications for expedited programs and orphan drug designations. So, with this stellar accomplishments, Dr. Cruz, we're so pleased to have you with us today to share your wisdom on global regulatory strategy. So, I will turn this to you at this time, and I will coordinate the questions as they come up towards the end of your presentation. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to meet with you all today, and for the warm welcome. So I'm looking forward to sharing some. I want to make this practical, understanding that the topic is very broad. I'd like to share what are in my experience, what are some of the things that we need to consider when putting together a global regulatory strategy, and what are some of the challenges that I've personally faced that I think are pretty common across the industry, and then some what I hope are helpful tips about how to make things go smoother. So with that, I want to start with a question to the group, and if you don't mind setting up the poll, I'd like to get a sense of the kind of work that you do. If is it drugs, biologic device, combination products, software, and I understand that some of you may not fit nicely into these categories, so you can approximate to the closest one. All right, looks like a lot of drug people. It's just helpful to get an assessment. My experience has been mostly on drugs and biologics. I'm now working on combination products. I suspect that in the next few years, a lot more of us will be working on combination products. So I just wanted to get a feel of where we are right now. I think it's interesting to ask this question broadly and then over time see how the landscape may change. Thank you. So I like to start with like a very big, not intended to be philosophical, but almost philosophical question about what do you think is the primary goal of the pharma enterprise? And you can just think about it. If you want to put it in the chat, you can, but it's meant to just I like to start with what is our mission, right? And I think we need to always keep in mind that for the most part, overwhelmingly, Our mission as regulatory professionals, and also the mission of sponsors and the mission of regulatory agencies, are really to make safe and effective products available to patients worldwide. And specifically, yeah, and quality products too, that's very true. And then as a regulatory professional, what are some of your goals that you have for your program? And it will vary depending on what it is that you work on and the stage of development that you have. And some goals will be shorter term and some will be longer term. But I think the primary goal tends to be to secure and to maintain worldwide regulatory approvals. But I want to note that while approvals are essential, we also need to work within our teams to enable access. And that can include working together, whether it's on reimbursement or on advertising and promotion, or how to support product supply. And so I want to make sure that throughout the presentation, I want to highlight the fact that regulatory is not an island. We work in teams, and we're a series of receive inputs from other functions, and our function then equally supports other functions. So it's all about our bi-directional contribution, so to speak. And so a comprehensive regulatory strategy will touch on every aspect of product development and lifecycle management. And I think we can't forget about the lifecycle management, because we want to ensure market sustainability of the things that we work on. And a good strategy informs the regulatory pathways that we're going to leverage. In and of itself is also informed by the goals that we have for the program. And then it helps enable these goals with plans that are actionable and that you can implement. And it will always carry some uncertainty. And that's why I have the scenarios over here going in both directions. Because a good comprehensive regulatory strategy has to plan for contingencies when plans change, because they will most certainly will change over time. And I just really like this definition that I saw recently of what is a global regulatory strategy. And I like it because, so it says, regulatory strategy is an organization's adaptation to progress its product from development throughout its life cycle. What I like about it is that it mentions adaptation and progress. And so I think that change is inherent to this definition. And I like it because while change has uncertainty, it also requires creativity. So in addition to regulatory being part of a team and working in groups, I think it's also important to note that within regulatory, the gray zones in regulatory means that we also have room to be creative. And I think of regulatory strategy as the roadmap to product development. So it starts, I have over on the right, the regulations and standards, and it moves on to, to other stops like the ICH guidelines and clinical trial design. It also includes non-clinical testing and CMC and the legal aspects like data protection, market exclusivity, and all the GXP compliance aspects. So it's broad. And importantly, this is influenced by every type of regulatory work that we all do. So all of the flavors of regulatory and all of the subfunction domains. So I have some of them here, like policy and intelligence and submission sciences and ad promo and QA. We can't forget about medical writing. That's also very important. So the domain of regulatory strategy is not just of strategists. And so I want to make sure that, that's sort of another key takeaway, that everyone within their function is empowered to contribute, and also it's not only informed, but also contributes to this regulatory strategy. And so strategy and planning, of course, go hand in hand. And what I'd like to go over for the next few slides is to go over some practical tips in what I think are some core regulatory documents intended to first inform you as you put together your regulatory strategy, and then help you craft this comprehensive global development plan. And of course, this will be different based on your product type, on the stage of development. And many of you that work in large pharma companies are very likely familiar with these, and you probably use these often. But however, a lot of my past regulatory experience, as Yoga mentioned, was as a consultant. And a lot of my clients were small and medium companies. And some of you, I think, are working in some of these smaller companies. And what I found is that often these companies may have had a well-developed US or EU-based reg strategy, depending on when they were based. But they often lacked a global regulatory plan. Also, sometimes some enterprises are focused on the next immediate milestone, and they don't necessarily have clear sights on what's long-range planning. So regardless of the type of company that we work at, as reg professionals, we always have to think globally and we have to think long-term. So the main core document that I want to go over for the next couple of minutes is a living document, just a regular Word document where you're going to put together your global regulatory strategy. So it's a document that is living and will give you a snapshot in time, but it's also forward-looking, as I was mentioning. It's essentially like an organized meld of all drug development facets, from pre-investigational all the way to marketing authorizations and into commercialization. And it's a document that has your strategy, it has regulatory, but it's something that has to be agreed to by multiple stakeholders. Again, you're always part of a team. And it will become more specific and substantive as the development of whatever you're working on progresses. I mean, there's only so much that you can really anchor on ambitions and lofty goals if you're still pretty early. But even if you're early, it's never too early to start thinking globally and long-term. And so I want to start with the landscape view. Essentially, in this document, you're going to lay out all of the assumptions that you have by regions. And you're going to include all of these assumptions by regulatory. So what do health authorities in that region have to say? What are any non-clinical, clinical CMC requirements that are specific to that region? A lot of it will be global. And then a lot of it will be then specific to the regions that you're targeting. And it may be completely global, or it may be just a couple of regions, depending on what the goals are for your program and more broadly for your organization as a whole. You need to make sure that you look at guidances and also what I call like de facto guidances that are not necessarily like FDA guidances, but they're official presentations or documents that health authorities have put forward publicly that become norm, even if they're not guidances. And you need to look at what are some known changes or things that are in the horizon that will be coming up for changes in policy, in standard of care, or in the competitor landscape for your particular product. I like to look at FDA summary basis of approvals. I like to look at EMA opinions and labels. And this is a good place for you to use good reg intelligence resources, both people, if you have regional leads, but also software that's available. And it's important to keep an eye out on your competitors as part of your regulatory strategy, because that will ultimately give you some precedence when it comes to reg decisions, and it can also inform any changes in policy. And it's important to look at this public information, because challenges that are faced by what I'm calling precedents, but also analogs, which are more often we work on things that are pretty unique. So you don't have a great like specific precedent, but you have what I call analogs, which are things that are like adjacent to what you're doing. And so I think it's important to search for what are some of the challenges that they faced based on information that they put up publicly, or maybe information that the health authority puts out publicly. And because then you get an idea of what the health authorities are thinking. And I just wanted to note that when thinking about global strategy, one thing that can be tricky is that often some of the documents may need translations, and it's something that requires a little bit of extra work. if you're when you're looking at things outside of the US and Europe. And then the other thing that that you should, like a core document that you should have, is a health authority interaction log. So when did you go to what health authority, what feedback was given, and a link to the minutes. It seems obvious, but many places don't have one. And I think it's important so you have a historical record of what the agency has already opined on. And sometimes you can even see a change in their feedback over time. Now, going into more specifics about your specific programs. Like I mentioned earlier, the strategy and this strategy living document that I referred to will outline your objectives and goals, and it's organized by phase and by discipline. And all of that is typically summarized in another document that belongs to the team, not just regulatory, that's called the target product profile. Now, what I have on the right is a generic example of a target product profile. And it's just intended to illustrate the kind of information that typically goes into one. So things like the indication, what you expect to be the efficacy, what is a specific patient population or subject population, some quality attributes, the safety, and it's all of this background info that you have now collected in your strategy document will inform your plans to enable this target product profile, which is an aspirational profile that that teams or companies will have. And so target product profiles are typically global documents, but the kind of data that would support, say, efficacy or the specific patient population may vary a little bit by region. So you always want to look at this from a global lens, but have to be aware that there can be some regional differences. And if you don't have a TPP, and many companies don't, I would advocate for one for your program. It's not an FDA requirement. You don't have to submit them. But I know that when I first started in regulatory, there were many companies actually included them as part of their INDs and just kept updating them accordingly to keep FDA informed of their plans. And so that FDA was aware of where they were in their aspiration as context of the kind of feedback that they were seeking. So I just find them to be very helpful overall. And then once you have this regulatory strategy document, and the global regulatory strategy document will essentially give you the stepwise plans that you need to take, you and your team will need to take to enable the TPP. Now, this slide is really busy, and I'm not going to go into the details of this given the time, but I did want to include some specific cross-functional questions and considerations that we need to ask ourselves and we need to ask of our teams to shape our program and thus your regulatory strategy. And so, like I mentioned earlier, your goals are often going to be global, but the pathways that you take and then the plans that you take are likely going to vary by region. So I'll just leave this here for a second so you can take a look, but we're not going to go into details. What I would like to do next on the next couple of slides is actually focus on forward thinking actionable plans that you should have as part of your regulatory global regulatory strategy. I think in the next 15-20 minutes, I'm going to start sounding like a broken record because I will probably say this a lot, but it's important to meet with health authorities. And in your living document, you should outline what are your planned and your potential future health authority interactions. And they can be things that are expected, like an end of phase 2 meeting or pre-BLA or pre-NDA meeting, but they can also be some that are, well, we're thinking about having a surrogate endpoint. We should talk about this earlier. Or we're thinking we're going to need a new formulation. And so we should plan in 2032 potentially, when we have that data, to support the bridging, and then see if the agencies are okay with that. So think not just of where you are right now, but always think ahead. And always think also that the interactions span all the functions, in terms of, can be for non-clinical support of clinical plans, they can be to discuss your clinical development plans, they can be used to discuss quality attributes, your commercial supply, and any differences that it may have from the product that you use in clinical trials. And think strategically about how you time these. There's no one size fits all strategy for this. Sometimes it may be better to approach an agency first, having an idea that they'll be okay with your proposal, get their buy-in, and then go to other health authorities and say, we have this proposal and this is agreed to by these people, and so now we want to get your opinion. And other times it may be better to bring the health authorities that you think are going to give you a harder time, or be more critical of your positions, and then get them on board first, and then take that to other health authorities. And depending on what the issue may be, your approach may vary, but always have to think about what the scenarios are of going to one first versus another. And I was recently at a conference where I was a bit surprised at how vociferously the presenters encouraged the use of parallel scientific advice. It's not used that often. In this specific, it's for FDA and EMA. It's not used that often. That's what the speakers were saying. They were like bemoaning the fact that it's not used often. But it could be convenient, and it could be a way that you can harmonize feedback from two of the major health authorities in a shorter time frame. And then specifically for EMA, depending on what your questions are, you may consider if you want to do central advice, or maybe you want to do national advice. Are you talking about doing a trial with a single site in one country, or are you doing a multi-region, multi-country study? And based on that, you may choose the most appropriate pathway. And I just want to emphasize that this decision, you inform that strategy and you give recommendations to your team, and hope that they heed your recommendations more often than not. But as you can imagine, for all of the potential types of questions that you may broach to an agency, they're cross-functional questions and decisions that have to be made. And I think it's helpful to note that what may be the best or the simplest thing or solution from a regulatory perspective may not necessarily be what's best for the program overall. So what patients want, what behooves your organization, both have enormous weight on regulatory recommendations and decisions. Just because something would be the regulatory path of least resistance may not be what's fit for purpose for your program. And then also in terms of things that you need to include in this living document, you must consider what are your filing expectations by region, and what are your timelines. And when I say timelines, I mean the timeline to file, the timeline to review, and the timeline to approve. It's going to be a puzzle. And then I have personally found that having a regulatory risk registry is also a very helpful tool. It's good for general awareness for your team. It's good for awareness for your management and your leadership of what are all of the regulatory risks that you may have at a given time. And then including mitigation plans in them, so that you start thinking, well, this may happen, but if this happens, these are some of the things that we can go about it. Or this is a huge risk, so maybe we need to intervene before it becomes more likely to happen. So I think separate or complementary to what would be a program's risk registry, a regulatory risk registry on its own is helpful. And so for this last part of the presentation, I just want to talk about strategy and planning go hand in hand, and I think the supportive action there is the implementation. So I want to talk about the implementation of your regulatory strategy and try to give some what I hope is practical advice based on what I found are the most common challenges that we face within regulatory. Um, to enable a global regulatory strategy, you'll invariably be working on having multiple regulatory submissions at roughly the same time going to different places. And these can be clinical trial applications, they can be meeting with health authorities, they can be marketing authorizations, or they can just be answering information requests that you have from global health authorities. And so while we spent already some time talking about the tools that can get us organized, like the strategy document, the TPP, the health authority interaction log, and the regulatory risk log, now I want to touch on a few more tips that I think may make our lives, on our team's lives, a little bit easier. And in my experience, the biggest challenges in enabling regulatory strategy center around these four things: planning, prioritization, communication, and resources. And when I say resources, I mean people, but it can also be money. But I mainly have found that the stickiest of issues are because of people, mainly um, people being stretched too thin, um, not having a particular type of expertise that's being represented in the team that you think it's needed, and just overall, sometimes when people are stretched too thin, you don't have good engagement from your colleagues, and then that can also be very much a problem. In terms of some tips for planning, I think having good sources of regulatory intelligence are critical. Understanding local regulations can be a huge task of its own. Understanding those local precedents is also, a big, separate but related task. So many companies will have regional leads. You should be good partners with your regional leads, and if possible, having robust reg intelligence support, again, whether there be in terms of people resources or also like automated software resources. I think it's very important. You should also have very defined roles, responsibilities, and expectations for any given workstream that you have. It just makes things run more smoothly. And when people know exactly what they have to do, I think they're more likely to do it, and they'll do it quicker. And in terms of tracking tools, I think having detailed content plans for submissions is key. And then another thing that I think is important and that I don't often see is keeping a record of what information has been sent to each health authority. Because sometimes an issue may be more critical for one health authority versus another. It may be that one health authority has more information or more updated information than the other. And knowing what info each organization has I think is helpful. And then other tracking tools I think are helpful for tracking the progress of a particular document or the overall submission progress, because I think it's helpful. Again, I always like to think long term. So at any given time, like, okay, we're like 40% of the way. These are the things that are left to do. These are the checklists of what we've done so far. And I think it's helpful to keep people, on task. I want to be mindful that I know that I have some questions in the chat. I'll get to those in a couple of minutes when I go through the next couple of slides, but thank you. In terms of prioritization, again, broken record here, meet with health authorities early and often, prioritize these, seek concurrence early. Success, I think, is built on the relationship that you have with health authorities and their knowledge of your product. So I can't overstate how important that is. I also think it is helpful to request protected time from your team, and also sometimes commitment from their management too, in order to prioritize what are some things that are time sensitive. And that can look like reserving 2 hours a week at the same day and time so that everyone can touch base on something, or having a standing meeting 1 hour a day because you all have to work. We are all expecting responses from an agency, and we need to work on a response document. But having that protected time from the team, I think, can be very helpful. And when it happens, I think it instills in the team the appropriate prominence that your work stream really has. And then related to what I brought up earlier was timing or staggering the submissions can be, for strategic and logistical reasons, can be very helpful, so that your team doesn't get, so your team knows what is most important, what is middle important, and what we could compromise if we need to. Now, in terms of communication, there are two things that I want to talk about. One is storyboarding, and the other one is scenario planning. And I think the challenges that I have found with communication are layered, right? So they come from maybe issues with communication within the team, can be within the line of business, within management, within leadership. And I think these two tools can help across the board for all of those. So what I mean by storyboarding is developing key messages that are guided by supportive data. And some are going to be very broad, and those are global typically. And then some are more regional. And you can have this for a health authority interaction, or you can have this for a big filing marketing authorization that you have. And it's just helpful whenever someone is reviewing a document to have the storyboard of this is the most important thing that we need, and this is how we get there, and this is data that supports it. And then the second being scenario planning. I think it's important to know, if this health authority comes back with this feedback and this health authority comes back with this feedback as we anticipated, how do we manage this? What do we do? If we can already see some things coming, we can triage decision making so that we can expedite our responses. And it's a way to address risks early. And that triage can be helpful to determine what is a decision that a team can make and what's a decision that your leadership has to be involved in. And maybe we can just triage the ones that we can make ourselves and then only raise the ones that really require more leadership buy-in. And then lastly, when it comes to resources, specifically people, I hope I've impressed the importance of having a team mentality, that we're not regulatory islands. And so we need to foster a group and team mentality. And we need to prepare our teams to be agile. And because sometimes dealing with disappointing or surprising regulatory feedback or divergent regulatory feedback can be demoralizing. I think it's important to celebrate small victories to keep things going, because this is a marathon, not a sprint. And then I always kind of like a label. I always think that we need to remember and remind others of what our goals are, and our goals being, start with the end in mind, to make safe and effective products available to patients worldwide. And so that's all I have for you. I'm happy to take your questions. And I'll start with a couple, if it's okay with you, Yoga. I can start with a couple of the ones that are in the chat, or what would you prefer?
Yeah, no, it's fine if you can just go through in sequence.
Yeah. So based on the experience, which function is typically responsible to lead the development of a TPP within an organization? In my experience, it's been commercial. It doesn't mean that it's the same across the board, but the last couple of places where I worked on that had a process for TPPs, they were led by commercial. What if you go to AMA and FDA in parallel and they get back to you with different advice? It happens. Sometimes they will disagree. Sometimes they will just disagree. So I think that if in this came up in the conference that I went to recently, where essentially the EMA representative said that if you're working on something that is maybe rare, there aren't many precedents, there isn't any guidance from either health authority, that would be a good project to, or a good topic to seek parallel advice on. That if you already know ahead of time that they are different, that it is not very likely that one of the agencies will drastically change your mind. So I think that's also something to keep in mind. But when there is um, less known, then that would be, you're more likely to get concurrence that way. And then, which of the major ECTD modules require the most individualizations between the different authorities? I have found that this substantial evidence of efficacy can vary a little bit depending on the pathway that you're pursuing. Some countries don't have accelerated approval or accept surrogate endpoints, some do, or they'll have different guidance on them. So that can vary. Overall, I have found safety to be pretty, like, relatively uniform. And then I think there's a fair amount of regional differences in quality, both approaches and some specifications. I'm not an expert on CMC, but that's just been my experience from colleagues. And then insight into regional differences on clinical trial timelines and success rates. Most often, I don't want to say most often, but in my experience, in order to fulfill regional requirements, we would do multi-site, multi-country studies. And so that we have the same, or like very, 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 very similar protocols across different regions. And so the clinical trial timelines tend to be similar because it's all part of the same protocol. And the success rates are also similar because we go into that country, I don't want to say knowing, because there's always a wild card, but with the expectation that they're going to agree with that they're going to give us an okay to proceed, and that they agree that what we're measuring is going to be supportive if the study reads out positive. So I think harmonizing the program, not necessarily running different ones in different countries, unless sometimes you do need to do that in order to get like a PK study in China or in Japan. That's different. But if you're doing a phase 3, more often than not, in my experience, we go for multi-country, multi-site studies. Okay, thank you. I hope you've learned something or can take something back to your teams and get them thinking about this.
Okay, are there any other questions? Well, you already discussed, Dr. Cruz, about the ECTD modules question, right?
Yes, that I find safety to be sort of harmonized, but efficacy may vary, and quality in my experience has varied, but I acknowledge that CMC is not my area of expertise.
So I have one question,
Mm-hmm.
which is, what would be the role of HTAs in global registration, and how companies can best prepare to meet the evidence standards in different regions? HTAs as in health technology assessments.
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and it's not something that I specifically touched on, but I think does reflect the sort of ethos that it takes a village, that it's not just regulatory, that we really need to work hand in hand with market access and commercial functions, because we can get a drug approved, but it doesn't mean that it's going to be prescribed or it's going to be reimbursed. And some of that's the remit of your health technology assessments. And so for those who may not be aware, what HTAs do is they provide evidence-based information to payers, policymakers, to give guidelines and help make decisions about whether to reimburse a new drug or a new health technology. And on their own, separate from what what like an FDA or an EMA would do, or a CDE or PMDA. They actually perform their own review of clinical effectiveness, of cost effectiveness too, as well as the safety. And they also take into account like ethical impacts and social impacts, and a negative assessment, even if you have an approval, can result in like can prevent access to a market. And so, just like I would say, you have to meet with health authorities early and often, I think you do need to engage with health technology assessment agencies early during development, understand the kind of data that they're looking to see. Are they okay with the data that you're already incorporating into your clinical development program? Or are they looking for other data? Are they looking for some patient-related outcomes and you're only having biopsy data? Are they looking for how, do they want to see people go to the doctor, have fewer visits when they to a doctor, seek less healthcare when they're on your medicine, as opposed to another thing that you're measuring in your study. So there are mechanisms where you can meet with HTAs directly. There are other mechanisms in which you can meet with health authority and the HTA agency in parallel. Depending on your questions, you may choose one versus the other. And I think it's helpful that just because you go to an HTA, let's say you go early in the program, the landscape changes over time. And so don't assume that what you heard 5 years ago or 10 years ago would still be the same. So you need to re-engage. And that means that you should have an integrated data plan that includes not only the data that you plan on collecting in your like phase 2, phase 3 studies, but also you want to consider what other types of data that can support a decision to reimburse based on what HTAs would like to see. So real world evidence, patient reported outcomes. You need to get feedback from what they want to see and then incorporate it into your CDP. Oh, and I see a question, have you used VivPro RA for your work? Yes, I've used it before to look at precedents, to look up summary basis of approvals, to look up labels. I've personally used it before. I found it helpful.
Just to add, the platform RIA has global regulatory information and can be searched, just responding to the question. Yeah. Any other questions? One final call. Else, can we?
Yes.
Can we close this webinar? But before I close, I also wanted to introduce you to Recon 2025. It's a conference to discuss how to set R&D strategy, including global harmonization. And because you have attended today, you can avail a code for $100 off from the registration, which should be on your screen on the bottom left-hand side. And as you can see, global regulatory harmonization is one of the topics. And at this conference, we bring regulatory authorities and pharma together to have a discussion in a neutral forum, the challenges, and discuss potential solutions to those. I would also like to request you to provide your feedback, which will be posted, as you see, it's posted. So if you can take a few seconds to give us feedback, it'll be very useful. Thank you very much.
Thank you again for the opportunity to meet and share some thoughts. And I appreciate the engagement from all of you with questions.
Thank you, Dr. Cruz, for taking time. Have a good day.
You do as well.